I had just reached what you today would call a young age, but in those days, it was already the age of a grown woman. My face still had traces of a girl, but my hands were already those of someone who worked hard, washing clothes in the river, tending the house, caring for the chickens. It was at that time your grandfather appeared in my path, with that way of his that could convince anyone. He arrived riding a dun horse, wearing a wide smile and carrying a look that seemed to promise everything and nothing at the same time. Are you curious to find out how it all happened? Then subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. I love to know where you're following me from. And look, if I were you, I wouldn't miss what's coming up. The truth I'm about to reveal will move you in ways you can't even imagine. Are you ready? In those days, young women did not choose as much as they do now. We were taught that marriage was destiny, and that when a man came along with decent manners and some honest work, it was better to accept than to keep waiting. I remember feeling a mixture of pride and unease when he started coming to our house. I would dress in my tidiest clothes, dab cologne on my neck, but every time he arrived, my heart beat so fast it felt as if it already knew there was something behind all that charm. But I was afraid to think it, afraid to doubt, because a girl who doubts too much ends up alone. That was what my mother always said. He did not speak much about the past. He would say he had traveled a lot, that he had worked on farms, in a brickworks, that he had helped an uncle drive cattle across the backlands. When I asked if he had a family, he would change the subject, saying the important thing was the future. And I, so young and wanting to believe, accepted that answer as if it were a crumb of affection. I clung to the little he did tell, making up the rest in my imagination. I told myself he was a good-hearted man who simply did not have the habit of opening up. The marriage proposal came on a hot summer afternoon. I was in the yard, scrubbing laundry in a zinc basin, when he arrived carrying a brown paper parcel. Inside was a new pair of shoes, something I had never received from anyone. He handed me the gift and said he wanted me to be his wife. There was no ring, no fancy speech, but in those times, that was enough. My father agreed at once. My mother just nodded, and so it was decided I would leave my home to begin another life. The night before the wedding, my mother sat beside me on the edge of the bed. It was one of the few times she spoke to me about feelings. She told me a man was a strange creature who needed respect and silence, that a good woman was the one who knew how to keep quiet more than she answered back. I didn't understand it all, but I kept that in my memory. It was like a password for survival. Be silent, be silent, be silent. The wedding was simple. We joined our lives in a little chapel on the hill. I wore a borrowed dress that smelled of cedar and the longing of other brides. Your grandfather looked handsome, his hair neatly combed, wearing the suit he said he had bought in a big city. When the priest asked if I accepted, I felt a coldness in my belly. But I said yes. That was what was expected. That was what every woman said. And so, not really knowing what awaited me, I started my story with him. At first, everything seemed to go as it should. He left early to work, came back only when the day was ending, always bringing some provisions in his leather bag. I cared for the house with dedication, wanting him to be proud of me. I made sure the coffee was hot, the kitchen clean, the shirts mended. That was my way of showing gratitude for being chosen. Because in those days, being chosen was a kind of salvation. But it did not take long for me to notice there was a place inside him I would never be able to reach. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see he was not in bed. I would go to the door and find him sitting in the yard, staring into the dark. When I asked if everything was all right, he would say yes, but his eyes were somewhere far away where I could not follow. I learned not to insist, because insisting was disrespect, and a woman who respected did not force a man to speak. I am telling you all this, my daughter, so you understand nothing happens all of a sudden. The day that woman walked into the wake and called me the middle wife was not the beginning of the humiliation. It was just the moment when everything became clear. The true beginning was in that yard, when he gave me that pair of shoes, and I accepted without asking where he came from or where he would go next. That was when I began to keep quiet. And when you learn to stay silent too early, you no longer know how to defend yourself. In those early days of marriage, I spent my time trying to earn love. I did everything right, as my mother had taught me. I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. I only gave thanks. And for a long time, he treated me with that polite distance that confuses a woman. It looked like affection, but it wasn't. It looked like truth, but it wasn't. And I was so young that I didn't know how to measure the difference. Today, when I think of that girl I feel like embracing her, telling her she didn't need to be in such a hurry to be a good wife, that asking wasn't a sin, that doubting wasn't shameful. But back then, no one taught us that. A woman who asked too much got a reputation. A woman who doubted became bitter. So I did what all the others did. I kept quiet. If I could, my daughter, I would have told myself that a man who never shares his past carries secrets that someday will come knocking on your door. But I didn't know. And when you don't know, all that is left is to follow the path you were taught. And that is how it all began, with silence, with fear of asking, with that naive hope that love without truth could still turn out right. I always say that our heart warns us. It doesn't shout, it whispers. But when we are in love, we prefer to pretend we don't hear. That was how it was with me. I saw small signs, little slips, but instead of asking, I turned my thoughts away, like someone who closes a door before the wind can get in. In the first months of marriage, everything seemed proper. Your grandfather left early, ate what I cooked without complaint, came home at the fall of evening. There were no fights, no harshness, but there was also none of that happiness I saw in other couples. It was as if we shared the same house but lived in separate worlds. I told myself it was only habit, that in time, trust would come. But deep down, I already knew there are things that never get right. There were days when he would not come home for supper. I would sit at the table with the lamp lit, waiting. The hours passed slowly, marked by the ticking of the wall clock. When he came, he always wore the same calm manner, saying he had been helping some neighbor. He never brought proof. He never looked sorry. And I, who had been raised never to make a scene, simply lowered my head. My eyes burned, but I swallowed my tears. There was one night I remember like a photograph that will never fade. It rained hard. The roof dripped into buckets I had set on the floor. I was afraid because in those days heavy rain could wash away bridges and bog the roads. He did not come. I prepared excuses in my mind, one prettier than the other, just so I would not think the worst. When the door finally opened, he came in soaked to the bone. I ran to fetch a towel. He thanked me, but did not look me in the eyes. I felt there was an abyss between us, and that if I asked where he had been, that abyss would only grow. So I stayed silent. The next morning, I rose before the sun. He was still asleep. I watched his face, trying to see the man I thought I knew. I asked myself if he had ever loved someone before me. I asked if he still loved her. But all those questions stayed locked in my chest because I did not have the courage to bring them into the light. Courage, in those times, was a rare thing in a woman's heart. The signs kept coming. Sometimes I would find little papers in the pocket of his coat, a note scribbled in haste, an address written down. Once, I found a woman's handkerchief, scented with perfume that was not mine. My heart raced, but my hands went cold. I folded that handkerchief and put it back where I found it, as if I had seen nothing. That was how I began to learn to lie to myself. The neighbors were not blind. There are always those who notice what we pretend does not exist. One afternoon, I went to buy flour at the shop and heard two women whispering. When I passed near, they went quiet, but I saw the way they looked at me. It was a look of pity that hurt worse than any word. I walked home with my head down, holding the tears in my throat. I told no one, because shame in those days was an illness you treated alone. Deep inside, I was sure he was hiding something, but it was as if my heart split itself in two, one part that knew, and the other that did not want to know. I clung to the good hours, the Sundays when he stayed home and helped me mend the stove, the days when he brought a parcel of new cloth and said it was a gift. But even in those moments, there was a silence between us that carried more truth than any speech. I know that you, hearing all this now, must think I was foolish. Maybe I was. But in those times, a woman had nowhere to go, no one to hear her. We were taught that keeping a marriage was more important than understanding the truth. And so I lived, filling in the gaps with hope. The hardest thing was feeling he was not afraid of being found out. It was as if he knew I would do nothing, that I would never have the courage to ask for an explanation. And he was right. I didn't. All I had was that resignation my mother taught me. All I had was that silence that, repeated so many times, became part of my breath. One day, I sat on the edge of the bed and cried softly, asking God to show me what to do. I asked for a sign, any sign that would give me courage. But the only sign I received was that emptiness that lives in a house when two people share it without sharing their hearts. I could have gone out to search for answers. I could have asked at the shop, in the neighbors' houses, along the roads he traveled. But I did not want to, because those who look find, and I was not ready to find. So instead of asking, I went on keeping quiet. That was how my silence began to grow roots. And each root was a certainty that one day the truth would come to find me. I just did not know it would come in a coffin, bringing with it another woman who would look me in the eyes and call me the middle wife. Time has a way of making us grow used to what hurts. That was how your grandfather's absences became part of my life. Like a bad habit, I no longer had the strength to fight. When he disappeared for an entire night, I would leave the lamp burning until the flame died on its own. Then I would lie down in bed and listen to the silence of the house, asking myself in my thoughts if this was truly what God had chosen for me. In the beginning, I still found the courage to ask. When he came home with a rough beard and wrinkled clothes, I told him I had been worried. He would answer in that calm voice, saying there was no cause for alarm, that a man had duties a woman did not need to know about. At such moments, my heart would tighten, but I lowered my eyes. I was afraid to provoke a bigger anger, afraid to hear a truth that would break me inside. So I only said that I understood, even though I understood nothing at all. The neighbors began to notice. No one spoke openly, but people are curious, and in that village everyone knew everyone else. I saw faces turning when I passed by. I felt the whispers that died down when I came close. Sometimes a bolder neighbor would try a disguised question. Your husband travels a lot, doesn't he? Or, it must be nice to have such a hard-working man. I smiled, even if inside my chest hurt like I had taken a blow, because in those days, shame was something you hid, as if it were the woman's fault. There was one night when he stayed away for 2 days. I counted each hour by the ticking of the clock, prayed to every saint I knew, begged God that no disaster had happened. When he returned, he offered no explanation. He laid his hat on the table, washed his face, and sat down to eat as if nothing had happened. I set the food on his plate and sat at the other end of the table. That silence was so heavy it seemed to fill the whole house. I thought of asking. I thought of crying. But all I did was chew slowly, trying to swallow not only the food, but also the disappointment. After that night, I realized he had grown used to disappearing, and I had grown used to waiting. Every time he left, it felt as if he took a piece of my peace with him, and when he came back, he carried in his gaze a distance I could never measure. I wondered whether he still remembered me when he was gone, but I never had the courage to know the answer. Sometimes he brought gifts, as if trying to patch up the holes his absences left, a piece of cloth, a ribbon, a sweet wrapped in paper. I thanked him, but I felt no joy. It was as if each gift came with a reminder. I can leave whenever I please, but I always return. And I accepted it because I did not know how to refuse. My mother, who came to visit me from time to time, noticed my sadness, but she too had been raised in that time when a woman was expected to endure quietly. When I complained, she only said, "Better he returns than never comes back." I thought perhaps she was right, and so, little by little, I convinced myself that this was my life, a long wait, sewn together with silence. Sundays were the hardest. I saw the other families gathered, the men talking by the door, the women preparing lunch, the children running around the yard, and I sat alone, pretending I didn't mind. The worst of all was pretending to myself, telling myself it was all fine, that it was just a phase, that someday he would settle down. But deep down, I already knew that peace cannot be taught to a man who never wanted to learn it. There was a day when it rained all day long. I sat at the window, watching the drops fall in the yard, and I thought my life looked like that rain, endless and cold. I realized I no longer felt anger, only a weariness that weighed in my bones. That day, I understood that my hope had turned into habit. I no longer hoped he would change. I only hoped that the next absence would take longer to come. Once, I heard a story that made my heart tremble. A neighbor told me she had seen him in the next town, entering a house that did not belong to any relative. I closed my expression, pretending I hadn't heard. But that night, I thought about it until dawn. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to ask in plain words whether there was another woman. But my fear spoke louder. Fear of confirming what I already suspected. Fear of having to decide what to do with my life. So I did what I always did. I stayed silent. And so the years went by. Each of his absences became routine. Each of my silences turned into armor. I no longer cried so much. I no longer felt that tightness in my chest that seemed it would kill me. A heart, when it takes too many blows, grows thick skin. But still, deep inside, there was a voice that never went quiet. The voice that said, "Love is not this. Love is not fear nor endless waiting." When he left on that last trip, I did not know it would be the final one. I stayed by the window until late, as I had so many other times. I waited for his figure to appear on the road. But who arrived was a young man bringing the news that he had died far away. It was that day I discovered I had become the widow of a man I had never fully known. And it was at that funeral that the other woman came in, with her steady eyes and her shameless voice, to call me the middle wife. I always thought the day my life would truly change would come slowly, like an illness you notice little by little. But it wasn't like that. It came like thunder. It was on a gray morning, with the sky heavy with clouds and a cold wind hitting my face like a warning. I woke before the sun, as I always did. I made the coffee, swept the yard, took in the clothes that had been left out in the dew. Everything was the same, but inside my chest there was already an unease with no name. That morning, he had not returned from the trip he said he would take. I counted the days in the marks drawn in charcoal on the kitchen wall. The days had passed beyond the line he usually respected. I kept telling myself it was only a delay, that perhaps the road was bad because of the rains. But deep down, I knew. We always know, even if we pretend not to. When the young man arrived riding a black horse, I felt the world grow dark. He stopped at the gate, took off his hat, lowered his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. My body understood before my mind. My legs went weak, my chest hollow. But still, I walked to him. I asked what had happened, hoping he would deny what I already feared. But he only said in a quiet voice that your grandfather was gone, that death had come suddenly, that I should prepare to receive the body. I did not cry in that moment. It was as if my tears were afraid to appear. I thanked him for bringing the news, went inside, and closed the door. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, not knowing what to do first. It was only after many minutes that the tears came. They came like a flood, carrying away the courage I pretended to have. The days that followed are a blur in my memory. The arrival of the coffin, the improvised wake in the parlor, the visitors who came more out of curiosity than comfort. I watched the women entering, adjusting their veils, looking around as if searching for fault in another's house. Some of the men came close to me with words of pity, saying I was strong, that God knows everything. I listened in silence, only nodded, because there was no answer that would fit in that moment. I thought the greatest pain would be knowing he died far away, with no family near, but it wasn't. The greatest pain was discovering he had never been mine alone, and that discovery came in the form of a woman who entered my parlor as if she had the right. She wore a dark dress, no paint on her face, her eyes steady. When she saw me, she did not lower her gaze. On the contrary, she looked at me as if she wanted to measure her grief against mine. I didn't know who she was, but my heart, which always knew before I did, understood everything at once. She came closer slowly, let her eyes pass over the coffin, and only then looked back at me. Then she said, in a voice that was not of anger, but also not of peace, "I am the one who came before. They say you were the one in the middle." In that instant, the floor vanished from under my feet. I felt my face flush, as if all the people were staring at me. I wished to disappear. I wished that woman would vanish. But she stayed there, standing, with a pain that was no smaller than mine. It was a different pain, in a different way, but just as true. I didn't say anything. I had nothing to say. The people in the room pretended they hadn't heard. A neighbor began talking to another. A man coughed. Someone rearranged the cloth covering the table. But I stayed there, motionless. The only thing that kept me upright was the habit of not falling, even when everything else collapsed. Deep down, I knew it was true. It had always been. I just had not wanted to see. After she spoke, she turned her face and left. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't insult me. She only left that sentence hanging in the air like a sentence passed by a judge. I never saw her again. I don't even know if she was really who she said she was, but it didn't matter. The harm was already done. That night of the wake, I sat on the edge of the bed and cried until there was no breath left in me. I thought of everything I had accepted in silence, of every night spent waiting, of every excuse I had invented. I thought that maybe, if I had asked, he would have told me. But I also thought that he had not told me because he knew I didn't want to know. And that was what hurt the most, realizing I had been an accomplice in my own deceit. When morning came, I dressed with the same care as always. I pinned up my hair, washed my face, made coffee for the visitors. Because in those days, a woman had to receive everyone, even those who came to see our disgrace. I served the coffee with steady hands, but inside I felt that something had died along with him. It was not only the husband I had lost, it was the illusion. It was the right to believe life had been whole and true. Since that day, I never again looked at myself the same way. I still lived many more years after. I still laughed, still cried, still was mother and grandmother. But a part of me stayed there, standing in that parlor, hearing that sentence no one dared to comment on. Because everyone knew the worst suffering is the one you cannot share. And I carried that pain with me like someone carrying a secret she never chose to have. After the wake was over, and the house returned to silence, that was when the shame truly came. During the days when the coffin lay there, I was so busy serving coffee, adjusting candles, thanking condolences, that I had no time to think. But when the people left, when all that remained was the smell of wilted flowers and burnt-out candles, that was when I felt the full weight of humiliation. I sat in the chair by the window and stared out at the empty yard. It was late, but I did not have the courage to lie down in the bed that had been his. I thought about that woman who came with such firmness, saying I was the one in the middle. I repeated those words in my mind, like someone repeating a refrain of bad luck. And the more I thought, the hotter my face burned with shame. But deep down, I knew that shame was not mine. I was not the one who lied. I was not the one who invented excuses to disappear. All I had done was believe. Believe because it was easier, because it hurt less than facing the truth. And because, in those days, a woman who asked too many questions lost respect. That was what they taught us from girlhood, that the best wife was the one who trusted, even when everything around her shouted for her to open her eyes. In those days after the burial, I had to relearn how to walk through the village. I felt the looks pressing on my back. People who once greeted me now only nodded from afar. Some looked with pity, some with scorn, but they all looked. And I, who never liked to be noticed, began to wish I could be invisible. One afternoon, I needed to go to the shop to buy cornmeal and salt. I entered with my head lowered, wanting only to make my purchase and go home. But the silence that fell when I stepped over the threshold was like a slap. It felt as though everyone had agreed to judge me without saying a word. The man behind the counter served me with too much politeness, that politeness given only to someone already stripped of respect. I thanked him, took my parcel, and left without looking back. But when I got home, I broke down. I cried like a child who has lost her way. It was there, sitting on the kitchen floor, that I understood the shame I carried was not only for what he had done, it was also for my part in all of it. The part of me that chose to stay silent. The part that chose to believe every half-told story. The part that wanted so badly to be a good wife that she forgot she was also a woman with feelings of her own. I know it may sound harsh for me to think this way about myself, but anyone who has lived through deceit knows we also hold responsibility for what we accept. I am not saying he was right to lie. He never was. But I also was not right to close my eyes so many times. I could have asked. I could have gone after the truth. I could have said I would not accept it, but I didn't. And that was how I became an accomplice to my own suffering. After a few days, my mother came to visit me. She entered without a word and sat with me in the kitchen. We stayed a while in silence, each of us holding our own pain. She was the first to speak. She said that men had always had two worlds, the one they showed and the one they hid, and that often a woman simply had to accept it. I listened but did not agree. For the first time, I felt anger at that idea. I thought it was not fair, that it was not fate. It was only cowardice from someone who did not have the courage to be whole. When she left, I stayed there thinking about the life I had led, a life of waiting, of silence, of wounded pride, and I wondered whether it had been worth it, whether that was what God wanted for us women, that we should carry another's shame as if it were our own. That night, I slept little. I dreamed of the other woman. In the dream, she did not look at me with contempt. She looked at me with compassion, as if she recognized my pain. I woke up thinking that perhaps we had both been deceived in the same way, that neither of us was to blame for loving someone who did not know how to love truly. The next morning, I rose early and made coffee as I always did. But there was something different in me, a part that had broken and another that had grown in its place. I did not yet know what that new part would become, but I realized that for the first time, I did not feel only shame. I also felt a small flame of dignity. It was small, but it was mine. That was how I began to understand that the shame that is not ours cannot bury us, that if we agree to carry in our hearts what someone else planted, we end up dying while still alive. And I had spent too much time being silent. Perhaps it was time to learn to speak. What few people understand is that my silence was not born of weakness. It was the opposite. In the beginning, I kept quiet because I was afraid. Later, I kept quiet because I learned it was my way of not letting others see me broken. Because if I started to talk, if I began to tell everything that hurt, I did not know whether I would have the strength to stop, and I needed to stay standing. Because in those days, if a woman fell, no one came to lift her up. After he died and everyone discovered he had another life besides mine, I realized there was nothing left I needed to defend. I no longer had to sustain the appearance of a happy marriage. I no longer had to smile at the neighbors, but even so, I kept my silence. Not out of shame, but out of decision, because it was the only way to keep some respect for myself. People expected me to speak ill of him, to tell details, to complain. There was a neighbor who came with curiosity disguised as comfort. She said, "You are so strong. I would not have been able to endure it." I only answered with a nod, because anyone who lived that story knew that strength was not a choice. It was a necessity. It was the only thing I had left. One day, the woman who cleaned the priest's house came to visit me. She said she brought words of comfort, but deep down, she wanted to know what I felt. I could see it in the way she looked at me. She wanted me to confess a pain she could turn into gossip. I looked at her and said very calmly, "He was the father of my children. The rest no longer concerns me." And that was all, because I had decided that would be my last word on the matter. After that, many people drifted away. Those who liked me only because of the appearance of a perfect family no longer had a reason to come near. It was a time of loneliness, but also of peace. I learned to wake without fear of hearing footsteps on the porch in the middle of the night. I learned to sleep with the certainty that from then on, everything I carried would be mine alone. I began to occupy myself with small things I never noticed before. I started tending the yard, planting flowers along the path. I spent hours sitting and sewing, watching the sun go down, feeling that for the first time I was whole with myself. There were no more excuses to invent, no stories to uphold. There was only my silence, which was my shield and my refuge. Some nights, I still woke up startled, thinking I would find him sitting out in the yard, but when I remembered he would never return, I felt a relief that was a mix of sadness and peace. That was how I discovered that absence can hurt less than presence, because a presence without truth is a loneliness in company, and I had already lived too much loneliness. One afternoon, one of my sisters-in-law appeared. She wanted to know whether I would go after the inheritance, whether I would fight over the property he had left. I said no, that I only wanted peace. She called me foolish. She said I was giving up what was mine by right. But I knew nothing in this world would give me back the time I had lost. No amount of money would buy the peace I was starting to feel. So I preferred to stay with my silence and my corner, free of disputes. It was during that time I discovered silence also has a voice, that when we stop speaking, we begin to hear our own soul. And inside me, there was a voice saying I could still be happy, not in the way I had dreamed when I was a young woman, but in a simple way, without lies, without fear, without pretending. I started getting out of bed earlier, walking down to the river to wash clothes, and while my hands scrubbed the fabric on the stones, my mind was free. It was as if I were also washing away the bad memories. When I came back home, I felt each day brought me a little piece of new strength. Time passed, and the pain changed its shape. It stopped being an open wound and became a scar. It still hurt when I touched it, but it no longer bled. I learned to look at the past without shame, because I knew I had done what I could. I had loved, I had believed, I had tried. And even though everything ended the way it did, none of it made me less worthy. If there is one thing I wish you to learn from my story, it is this: silence is not always cowardice. Sometimes it is simply the courage not to give another person the power to destroy what little we have left. My silence was my way of refusing to let the shame he brought become my identity. It was my way of saying, even without words, that I was still standing. And that was how, after suffering so much in silence, I discovered there was a strength no one could take from me. A strength made of silence, of patience, and of dignity. And that strength, my child, was what saved me. It took me many years to understand that he was not everything in my life, that what I felt for him did not have to occupy every corner, as if I were a house built only to hold his love. When we are young women, we learn that a man is the center, that marriage is destiny, that a woman's happiness depends on being well chosen and well kept. And I believed that with all the strength I had. In the first times of mourning, I felt as if my story had ended. I would wake in the middle of the night and ask myself if I would ever feel joy again. I looked at the empty bed and thought my life was broken in a way that could not be mended. But time, which is patient, began to teach me another truth: that no one is everything to anyone, that to love someone does not mean to forget yourself. I began to notice this in the smallest gestures. When I walked out to the yard and saw my flowers growing, even after so much sorrow. When I sat by the riverbank and felt the cold water running over my hands, bringing a relief I could not explain. When I looked at the children who came to visit me and realized that life carried on even though my heart was tired. It was on a Sunday afternoon that I truly understood. I was sitting on the porch, sewing a piece of light cloth, when a group of young women passed by, speaking loudly. They laughed, traded confidences, talked about their sweethearts. I watched them, remembering myself in those days when everything was a dream. I thought about how much I had believed that to be a woman was only to wait for a man to arrive and stay. And I thought about how much that idea had made me suffer. That afternoon, for the first time, I felt a hint of gratitude that he had left this world, not because I wished him harm, but because his death had also been the death of my illusion. It was only after he departed that I could ask myself who I was, besides being his woman. And at first, I did not know how to answer. But little by little, I discovered there were other parts of me he had never known. Perhaps even I had never known them. I discovered I liked to walk alone, without having to account for every step. That there was pleasure in sitting in silence with a book, without fear of seeming lazy. I discovered that laughter came more easily when I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. And so, I began to understand that he was not everything, that he was a part of my story, but he was not the whole story. There were those who said I had turned into a cold woman after he died, that I had lost my faith in love. But it wasn't so. I had only stopped thinking that love was suffocation. I had learned that true love does not trap, does not lie, does not pretend. And if I were ever to love again, I wanted it to be in another way, a way that was freer, cleaner, calmer. I also began to think of the children who remained. I thought about how I wanted them to see love, not as a prison, but as a meeting, not as a burden, but as a sharing. And I swore to myself I would never teach my daughters to accept less than they deserved, nor teach my sons to think a woman must endure everything in silence. During that time, I began to write thoughts in an old notebook I found in the drawer. I wrote down everything that came to mind, good memories, old sorrows, questions I had never had the courage to ask. When I read those pages, I saw my life was bigger than my marriage, bigger than the pain. It was also made of moments when I was happy alone, even if only for an instant. I wrote a sentence I keep to this day. We are not only someone's woman. We are daughters. We are friends. We are mothers. We are whole souls. When I finished writing it, I felt as if I had recovered a piece of myself that had been lost for years. That was how I realized he was not everything, that the world did not end just because he was no longer there, that there was a future that no longer depended on his presence. And that certainty was the seed of a peace I had never felt before. I still cry when I think of what could have been different. It still hurts to remember the lies, the absences, the day that woman entered the room and called me the middle wife. But today I know none of that defines who I am, because I discovered, through pain and silence, that life does not fit inside anyone's chest, and that no love has the right to steal the dignity of the one who offers it. If there is a day marked in my heart as a kind of rebirth, it was the day I finally spoke. I am not talking about loud arguments or scandal. I am speaking of words said with truth, words that come from within, that are born in that part of us that has been mute for years. For a long time, I believed that speaking changed nothing. I told myself silence was protection, that it was a sign of respect. But after he died, after the whole truth laid itself bare before me, I began to understand that my silence was not only defense, it was also a prison, and I had been the one who locked the door. I remember an afternoon when one of my daughters came to visit me. She brought fresh bread and sat with me in the kitchen. We talked about everyday things until, all of a sudden, she asked, "Mother, were you happy?" It was as if someone had set a lantern inside my chest, lighting up all the dark corners. I looked into her eyes, and for the first time, I felt the will to tell the whole truth. I took a deep breath. My voice came out low, a little unsteady, but it came. I said that for many years I thought I was happy just because I had a house, a husband, and children. Because that was what we were taught, that a woman was born to serve, to wait, to endure. But after everything ended, I realized happiness cannot be made only of silence, that there are things we must say, even if they hurt, even if they ruin what seemed beautiful. My daughter stayed quiet, her eyes full of tears. I thought she would get up and leave, that she wouldn't want to hear anymore. But she took my hand and said, "I always wanted to know who you really were." That sentence undid me, because I understood that all this time I had hidden not only my pain, but also who I was. I had become a shadow of myself, afraid of seeming ungrateful, of seeming like a difficult woman. That afternoon, I told everything I had never told. I spoke of the notes I found in his pockets. I spoke of the nights he never came home. I spoke of the other woman who showed up at the wake and called me the middle wife. I said everything without raising my voice, without crying out loud. It was as if the words, kept inside for so many years, had lost their weight. And when they were finally spoken, I felt my chest so light that I thought I might float. After that day, I decided I would never again swallow what needed to be said. It was not about disrespect. It was only the certainty that those who keep silent too long end up disappearing. And I had already disappeared inside myself for too long. I began to have small courages. When someone asked me about my marriage, I no longer said, "It was all good." I said, "There was love, but there were lies." When the neighbors came asking if I missed him, I answered that I did, but that I also felt relief. And if anyone was scandalized, I did not apologize, because no one had lived in my place. I realized that with every truth spoken, I reclaimed a piece of what was mine by right. The right to tell my story in my own words, the right to say I had been deceived without feeling guilty, the right to admit I had not always been happy, but that I had survived anyway. One night, I dreamed of him. In the dream, he was sitting at the edge of the bed, like he did in the early years. He looked at me with that calm expression that always confused me. But in the dream, I did not grow small. I looked back and said, "I deserve the truth." He did not answer. He only lowered his head. I woke up crying, but it was a good kind of crying, from someone who finally understood she owed nothing to anyone. I know that people looking at my life from the outside might think I spoke too late, that words kept for so long lose their power, but I say they don't. Because when we speak, even after many years, something inside the soul finds its place. Something settles. Today, when I think about that afternoon in the kitchen, I feel it was there I began to be born again. It was there I learned that having a voice is not about shouting. It is simply about not staying silent when the soul wants to speak. It was there I discovered I was more than his woman. I was myself, whole, made of courage, of fear, of mistakes, and of truth. If there is one thing I want you to keep, my daughter, it is this. Never believe silence is a virtue when it becomes hiding. Speaking is a risk, but silence can be a slow death. And I have died inside more than once. But it was on that day, when I told everything, that I truly began to live. When everything quieted down and the curious ones went away, What remained was the silence in the house. Not that heavy silence I used to carry before, made of fear and waiting, but a new kind of silence, one I didn't yet know whether it was peace or simply absence. I woke early, as always, and for a while I still found myself wondering what he would be doing if he were alive. But little by little, I realized I no longer thought of him so much, that my life was filling with other small presences that no longer depended on him. What was left after him was a yard that started to bloom again, because I began to care for the plants with a dedication I hadn't had before. It was as if the earth itself was asking me to begin again. I spent mornings tending the soil, trimming branches, pulling weeds, and in that simple work, I gathered up pieces of myself. I thought, he didn't take everything, because truly, he didn't. He didn't take my ability to feel joy in small things. He didn't take my love for the smell of fresh coffee, the song of the birds, the fluttering of the laundry on the line. My memories stayed too. And I won't lie, many were good. There were days when he came home tired from work and sat beside me on the porch. There were nights he held me and made me believe life was fair. Those memories I never wanted to throw away, because even in a story that hurt, there were moments of tenderness. I learned I didn't have to deny everything just because it didn't end well. I could keep what was sincere and let go of what was false. What also remained was the lesson. The understanding that trust isn't something you give away for free to someone who doesn't know how to care for it, that a woman doesn't have to settle for too little just because she is afraid of being alone. I learned that loneliness isn't the worst thing. The worst thing is to live beside someone and feel invisible. And that I would never again accept. After him, I had the courage to teach other women not to repeat my silence. I began to speak to my daughters and granddaughters in a way my mother never spoke to me. I told them that love is good only when it is free, that respect must be real, not only for show. I shared my story not so they would pity me, but so they would learn, so they would never allow themselves to be only the one in the middle in anyone's life. My faith also remained, though it changed its shape. I still believed in God, but I no longer thought he wanted my suffering as proof of devotion. I began to talk to God like someone talks to a friend. I would say, "You know I tried, that I did the best I could," and I felt that he listened without judgment. The days grew lighter, not because the pain disappeared, but because it no longer had the right to rule me. I no longer woke up thinking of him. I no longer fell asleep remembering the sound of his footsteps on the porch. I began to fill my mind with other things. The smell of clean clothes, the bubbling of beans on the stove, the stories my grandchildren invented. And it was like that, without haste, that I understood life still had more to give me. I also discovered it wasn't too late to feel like a whole woman. I started looking in the mirror without hurry. I saw my white hair, the lines at the corners of my eyes, and I felt no shame. On the contrary, every mark was a reminder of all I had survived. I began to love myself in a simple way, without needing anyone's approval. What was left after him was the certainty that I could begin again, that no love defines us forever, that losing doesn't mean life has ended. What stayed was gratitude for the children I had, for the strength I didn't know lived inside me. What stayed was the story, which now belongs only to me, told in my own words. And if anyone asked me after everything whether I regretted it, I would say I didn't. I only regret what I didn't say, what I didn't ask, what I didn't have the courage to face. But I don't regret having loved, because loving, even if it was the wrong person, made me human. And to be human was all I ever wished to be. If there is one thing I have learned from everything I lived, it is that we spend so much time trying to understand others, and almost none trying to understand ourselves. I lost years trying to decipher your grandfather, wanting to know where he went, what he felt, why he never stayed. I thought that if I discovered every answer, my pain would disappear. But today I know there are questions that only exist to make the heart weary. If I could leave you one piece of advice, my daughter, it would be this: do not forget to look inside yourself, because all our lives they taught us that a good woman is the one who cares for everyone else, the one who does everything for her children, who sacrifices her own peace to keep the house standing. And yes, that has value, but it also has value to remember we were not born only to serve, that our voices matter, that our feelings are worthy of care. I want you to understand that love does not have to hurt so much to be love. I spent years believing it was normal to feel afraid to ask questions, that it was natural to swallow tears so as not to look weak. But it is not. Love that traps you, that demands silence, that steals your peace, is not whole love. It is attachment. It is the vanity of possessing someone. It is fear disguised. I also want you to know that dignity is not something you bargain away. When your grandfather appeared that first day, riding his horse with that easy smile, I wanted to believe he was my destiny. And perhaps he was, but no destiny has the right to take from us the courage to be honest. If I had spoken, perhaps many things would have been different, but I did not know. And when you do not know, you do what you can with the little you were taught. If today I have peace in my heart, it is because I understood that each of my silences was part of the woman I was. I no longer blame myself, but I also do not romanticize it. I accept it. It was my way to survive, but if I could choose, I would have learned sooner to speak. I would have given myself the right to ask, to question, to say that I was not all right. I do not know whether this advice will serve you. Every woman has her own path. Every heart has its way of learning. But if you remember me when you are faced with some doubt, I ask that you do not swallow your truth, that you do not accept less than complete respect, that you never think you have to shrink yourself to fit in anyone's life. I also want to tell you that forgiveness is something we first do for ourselves. It took me a long time to forgive your grandfather, even longer to forgive myself. But today I understand that resentment is a chain. It traps us in a past that will never return. I still cry sometimes, but my tears are not of bitterness. They are only longing for what could have been. And longing does not kill. It only reminds. If I could leave you an inheritance, it would not be the few things I gathered in this life. It would be the courage to be whole, to never feel ashamed of feeling, to never be afraid to say, I deserve more. Because you do, my daughter. You deserve clean love, true presence, honest words, and most of all, you deserve yourself. If one day you find yourself alone, remembering everything you heard from me, I want you to know it was not in vain. I shared my story because I believe that pain shared becomes a seed, and one day that seed will bloom into strength. Because if my silence was my prison, my voice, even if late, was my freedom. And so, from everything I have lived, this is what remains: the certainty that no one can define us except what we carry in our hearts. I was a woman, a wife, a mother, but above all, I was someone who learned to respect herself, and that, my daughter, is what I most wish for you to learn too. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.